Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Senate race in the state of New Hampshire and covering some of the recent polls that indicate that Republicans may be having a late surge in the state of New Hampshire just 6 days out from the midterm elections. And of course, we're also going to be covering Real Clear Politics, moving this race from a race that tilts towards the Democrats that now tilts in favor of the Republicans, which, if Republicans have a good night, would give the GOP their 54th Senate seat, which would mean that they could potentially be on track to win 60 Senate seats in the 2024 Senate races. So huge implications with this race here. Of course, we're going to be covering this as well as some of the recent polling out of the state, and finally New Hampshire's electoral history as it relates to Maggie Hassan in particular. So we're going to take a look at all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below, liking this video if you enjoy. We're going to be live streaming on election night. Link to that is in the description down below. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So taking a look at some of the recent polls that we got out of the state of New Hampshire. Now, originally, New Hampshire was a state a lot of people, including the Republican Party, had essentially written off. Don Bolduc was seen as somebody that wasn't exactly electable. He was too far right for the state. He was too MAGA. You know, obviously New Hampshire is not exactly a very MAGA-friendly state. They voted against Donald Trump by 7 points in 2020. Of course, in 2016, the state was relatively close. Donald Trump almost won New Hampshire, but he would have gone on to lose it anyway in 2020, even if he had won it narrowly. In this race, however, the polls are really starting to tighten in favor of the Republicans late into the game. If we take a look at some of the early pollings out of New Hampshire, the race was really a double-digit race in favor of Maggie Hassan. Closest polls early on had Maggie Hassan up by about 6 points. And that was Trafalgar. Trafalgar's a right-leaning pollster, and they had this as a 6-point race. And then, of course, as we got past the primary in September, we started to see some polling. Bolduc was still down by 11, 9, 13 points. And then slowly over time, this margin starts to narrow up, where now Don Bolduc is consistently polling at 47 or 45%. Maggie Hassan is now polling below 50% in the latest 4 polls that we have out of this race. And the newest poll we have from St. Anselm College has Don Bolduc leading by 1 point with only a 2.5% margin of error. And this poll is being taken very seriously because this is not a partisan poll. This isn't a coefficient or insider advantage poll. Even the Emerson poll had Bolduc only down by 3. Of course, I guess this is when you account for leaners or something like that. So this race has been tightening all across the board, and it leaves many people wondering if Don Bolduc can actually pull this off. Now, of course, for Bolduc to win in New Hampshire, Republicans would need a very favorable environment nationally, and so far it looks like they're on track to get that. They're currently leading the RCP average in the generic ballot by 2.8%, and despite some criticism of certain right-wing polls being thrown into the aggregate, some of the more left-leaning polls, Data for Progress, CBS News Tracker, these polls have come out and have Republicans up by 2 as well. So this doesn't really seem to be something that just right-wing polls are fleshing out. It seems like every poll across the board sort of agrees that Republicans are going to win the generic ballot by at least 2 points. I think they'll probably win it by 4. That was my prediction a couple days ago. But anyway, this would be an environment that New Hampshire could potentially flip in. I mean, if we go back to the 2020 election, for instance, this was an environment where Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 4.5%. So you're talking about a D+4 national environment. And New Hampshire went towards the Democrats by over 7 percentage points. Now, New Hampshire does have this streak of being very anti-incumbent. Of course, we saw this in 2000 as well with George W. Bush. He won the state narrowly in 2000. Then, of course, in 2004, he lost the state by about 3 points, I think, to John Kerry. So this is a state that historically has swung against the incumbent in most elections, even with Obama, 2008, 2012, and of course with Trump, we saw that fleshed out as well. So this isn't a presidential election, but it does point out the fact that New Hampshire is still a pretty elastic state. It's not as blue as Vermont, Maine, or Massachusetts, any of these other New England states. It's very much still a purple state, even if it does have a blue tinge to it. But looking at this race in particular, Maggie Hassan, the incumbent Democrat, is not exactly a strong candidate. Back in 2016, she only won this race by 0.1%. Now, she did defeat a popular Republican incumbent, but many attribute this to the strong national environment. Now, New Hampshire is a complicated state because nationally speaking, it is still a blue state. Wave years, that can change sometimes. Of course, 2010, Kelly Ayotte won in a pretty big Republican wave year. But of course, Maggie Hassan in 2014 won her race for governor in a red wave year as well. So it goes to show you that national politics and statewide politics are very different in New Hampshire. Of course, Kristi won by over 30 points in 2020, and yet You had Jeanne Shaheen winning by like 16 on the same ballot. So New Hampshire treats federal politics and local politics very differently. But when we look at the environment we're expected to see in 2022, it looks like Don Bolduc has a shot at pulling this off. Now, I still think Maggie Hassan has the advantage. I'd like to see a couple more polls, although we only have 6 more days, so there's really not a lot of time left. But if the momentum is really building in Bolduc's favor, and if he's down only by 2 or even a point on election day, I'd say he's a slight favorite to end up pulling an upset in this state. Because again, New Hampshire is a very elastic state. More so on the statewide level, but even federally as well. It's a state that's known to split tickets, and it's a state that admires hard campaigners, people that actually campaign hard for their seat. And Don Bolduc, from what I hear, is doing 6 to 7 events around the state of New Hampshire every day. Maggie Hassan has been having a very light schedule in this race because I think early on, and honestly, you can't really blame her, she had a clear advantage. And I think over time, because of the national environment, because of Maggie Hassan, I think being a weaker incumbent, she's not nearly as popular as Jeanne Shaheen. She took a lot of things for granted, and as a result, now she's in sort of a tight race with Bolduc. She has the potential to lose. Again, we don't know if this national environment is going to be R+2, R+4, R+6. Any one of those should concern her, because any environment where the Republicans are doing well nationally, New Hampshire is very receptive to that, at least in their federal races. So, of course, in 2020, Democrats did extremely well. Federally speaking, you had both House seats go to the Democrats. Now we're looking at a situation where New Hampshire won. Republican challenger is actually pulling ahead of Chris Pappas in that race by a decent amount, so much so that it's outside the margin of error. That was the exact same poll that had Hassan down by 1. I think Pappas was down by about 6, which is really incredible, and honestly, really, I think is a game changer in that race. My prediction with New Hampshire 1 staying blue probably could be incorrect, and of course, I'm going to have one final House prediction released just before the election, but it goes to show you that things are really changing. The national environment is really shifting in Republicans' favor. And of course, we could take a look at RCP's official Senate prediction. They now have New Hampshire as a flip. So that would give Republicans 4 flips in the Senate. They would net 4 seats because of that. So they'd be up 54 instead of the 50-50 tie that many people had thought would happen for months, especially back in the summer when Republican momentum sort of stalled. So Bolduc has been doing really well as of late. Will it be enough? Will this late surge be enough to bring him over the top? Potentially, but there's still work to be done. There's still 6 more days. There's still data to analyze, of course, with the rest of the battleground states as well. Republicans are looking much better in Georgia than they had been a few weeks ago. Of course, they're looking really good in Arizona, which, again, Masters looks like to be the favorite to pull an upset at this point, something I said would happen for months now just because of the national environment. Because when it comes to midterm elections, the national environment and the fundamentals are really the key. You can talk about candidate quality. You can talk about other issues in Senate races, various scandals, whatnot. But at the end of the day, whether a candidate is good or bad or not, unless they're not really terrible or really unelectable, if the national environment's in their favor, that's going to give them a boost. And in most cases for the Republicans, even though many criticize the Senate recruits early on as not being really strong, it looks like they're all going to pull out victories at the end of the day, and potentially even an upset in New Hampshire. And I'd certainly call New Hampshire an upset because I don't exactly consider New Hampshire a toss-up. But at this point, it seems like it very well could be a toss-up. I'd like to wait to see a couple more polls, but in a couple of days, I'll release my final Senate prediction for the midterms. And ultimately, I'll have to make a determination as to whether or not this will stay with Maggie Hassan or if this state's going to flip for Don Bolduc. Kristi is also running for re-election on the exact same ballot. Of course, governors in New Hampshire and Vermont are elected every 2 years. But that's really not something that's going to help Don Bolduc in any way, I think. Kristi won a landslide victory back in 2020, mainly because of the fact that you had COVID happen and there was a huge break in favor of incumbents, and he beat a very underfunded incumbent by almost 33 percentage points. So, this had no impact on the down ballot races. This didn't help Donald Trump. This didn't help the House candidates. Kristi is very much his own candidate. And I think this time around, even though Kristi has endorsed Don Bolduc, I don't really think he's doing any events for him. I don't know for sure. But I think he's really running his own race, and Bolduc is really running his own race. Of course, Tulsi Gabbard has come to New Hampshire to help Don Bolduc campaign. Tulsi Gabbard is seen as a very libertarian figure, very anti-war figure. Bolduc is sort of more of a war hawk candidate, or at least he has a history of doing that. So that's not really something popular in New Hampshire. So some argue sending Tulsi Gabbard to Bolduc to help him out would be a game changer. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I just think the national environment is really giving Bolduc the lift he needs to defeat a Democratic incumbent this year. So ultimately, A lot riding on this. Obviously, if Republicans have 54 seats in the Senate at the end of the day, that I would consider a pretty significant red wave, especially since a lot of pollsters had this as 50-50. 538 still has this as 50-50 in terms of the overall balance of power in the Senate. So RCP, I think, is definitely giving Republicans a lot more credit this year than I think a lot of other outlets have. A lot of other outlets are much more cautious, or they're sort of giving Democrats the advantage in a lot of these races, where the polling and the trends that we've seen recently doesn't necessarily give them that exact advantage, because in a lot of these states, polling underestimates Republicans. And some have argued this will be the year where Democrats are underestimated in polls, but I think it's not exactly likely, especially since this is something we're seeing not just state by state, but all around the country. If this was just a New Hampshire thing, or if this was just a Nevada thing, you could probably write that off. But the fact that the national ballot is going in favor of the Republicans more heavily now, all of the other swing states, the Republicans are pulling ahead in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, they're getting close. So because of all those other factors, you're really looking at a situation now where you can't really ignore this. You can't really pin this down on just right-wing polls sabotaging the aggregate, as some on MSNBC have said. I think this is very much a real thing. I think Republicans are on track for about 53, maybe 54 Senate seats, but who knows? Of course, we're just 6 days away from Election Day and anything can happen, but this is a really big development for the Republican Party, because if they're able to put Don Bolduc over the finish line, it'll just increase their majority in the Senate. And of course, Republicans saw this opportunity as well. They started putting money into New Hampshire again. They kind of left Bolduc high and dry for a little bit after the primary because they didn't see him as electable, but then some polls came out. Bolduc was campaigning all over the state, and I think they made a different determination. And from their point of view, it's probably the right determination, because this could very well be a pickup for the Republican Party. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel. Be sure to follow the link down below to the election night live stream, set a reminder. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.